You're listening to The Unstoppables, where each week we show you how to overcome obstacles and transform the sting of failure into the reward of growth. And now, here's your host, best-selling author, keynote speaker, and CEO, Bill Wooditch.
You're tuned into The Unstoppables. It's the place where we turn your intentions into dollars. You have an idea, you have a concept, you have a way, you have a lot of ambition. It's burning inside you, but you're stumbling. You need not only a little bit of inspiration, but you need inspiration from those people who are credible. Those people that have done what you're attempting to do or what you're doing right now. I'm fortunate because I have such an individual with me today. His name is Deke Copenhaver. He has a lot of things, among them, a consultant. He's the former mayor of Augusta, Georgia, and the author of The Changemaker, The Art of Building Better Leaders. Deke, welcome to The Unstoppables.
Bill, thank you so much for having me, man.
First thing I see is the art of building better leaders. And so many people would have you think it's a science. I tend to lead in your camp that it's an art. So why did you choose art over the science?
Because it really is an art form to develop new leaders. But it's interesting. I had a gentleman at a speaking engagement last summer ask me, what's at the core of your book? And I said, it's that in leadership positions, even in politics, you can treat people with dignity and respect and maintain your character and integrity and still be successful. And the guy said, well, I can't wait to read it because I don't think that's possible. But I think those things, focusing on character and integrity, that there's an art form to shaping people into that type of leader.
I think character and integrity are experienced and lived. And I think that the more we talk to other people about our integrity, the less we probably have. At least I know that from my company, that's what we do is live it. If we have to say it, we have to write it, we're probably not living it. And it's up to another person to experience that because our performance, our word and bond has to be consistent. You have change, which scares a lot of people, change makers, but you also believe that leadership comes in many forms, whether you're a CEO of a large company, an entrepreneur building a small business, or a single parent struggling to run a family. You say that strong leadership is lacking without the willingness to bring about change. Why don't you explain that to me, please?
Well, it's interesting, and I know change is scary, but change is constant. We look at the world we're living in today, and you've got to either adjust to it and be able to pivot, or you're going to get run over by it. But I will say it was interesting to me when I first ran for mayor. The general consensus was I wouldn't get 6% of the vote. I was told that, but I understood that people fundamentally here locally were ready for a change in the way politics was done. So I took a flyer out on myself, and it worked. So by never going negative, by never throwing colleagues under the bus, by trying to focus on inspiring and being a positive leader, I won 3 elections with an average of 64% of the vote. So people will embrace positive change if they're offered it. I believe that.
We're going through a time of change now. And by the way, I would vote for you. We're going through a time of change and uncertainty. Those are two things that bring people to a place of, it's a scary place. It's a place of fears. That's the unknown. While you were mayor, you navigated one of the biggest catastrophes or crises in the state. Tell me about that, and tell me how you helped the people get through that experience.
It's interesting, and I appreciate you asking that. So my last year in office was 2014. And I thought, well, okay, I'm good now. Yeah, I'm just going to coast through. Well, February of that year, we had the storm of the century here, which was a catastrophic ice storm. And I'll tell you a good story about it. I was speaking at the Philips Healthcare Mega Conference in Orlando that Tuesday. So I got off the stage, and my assistant said, all the flights back into Atlanta have been canceled. And so I'm like, there is no way I'm not going to be in Augusta when this goes down. So we drove back and managed to get back right ahead of the storm, 11 o'clock that night, the fire chief brought by the order for me to declare a state of emergency. And then next morning at 9 a.m., I'm on the TV with Jim Cantori. And it was devastating. We actually ended up having a mild earthquake after the storm had hit. But it was really, the community pulled together. And one of the things that I focus on is in situations like this, in leadership positions, you have to maintain your composure. And I tell people, I draw the analogy, if I'm on a flight and we hit turbulence and I look at the flight attendant and she looks fine, I'm good. If she doesn't, I start to get a little worried. So people in leadership positions in crises, the ice storm just being one of them, you have to maintain your composure because the team around you is looking to you. So, but you got to make sure to give people all the facts and be realistic with it as well. But calm, composed leadership during crisis is absolutely key.
I learned this the hard way. And I learned that, and this is a good lesson for young leaders, is optics are important. How you carry yourself sets an emotional bandwidth, an emotional wake. And through that wake, your people follow. And they're either bobbing up and down in uncertainty, or they're calm because you're steady with that wake. You're consistent. And what you talked about, realistic expectations are huge. You've got to be able to manage people's expectations no matter what. It's one of the most important things we do in change. And I'm interested to know how you define a change maker. What is it inside a person more important, do you think? And what kind of actions do they take from that internal governor?
To a large degree, it's an ability to resist the status quo and take a leap of faith. So as I said, prevailing wisdom said I wouldn't get 6% of the vote when I first ran for office. But sort of the same thing, I had a radio show for a year and call-in show, but when I first went on, I didn't know where to plug my headphones in. But I always believe that, you got to throw yourself in the deep end. And it's with my book, it's sort of the same thing. It's at the age of 51, I release a book, and I will say I'm adjusted to change like everybody else. I spoke at University of Texas, El Paso 2 weeks ago, Tuesday. And I'm like, okay, here we go with these big university speaking engagements. And, that Wednesday when we got home, the whole world had changed. And, nobody's speaking on college campuses now, but you have to pivot and you have to adjust. And what we're doing now, the content is still key, and getting good information out there to people can be done remotely. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do that.
What kind of mental state do you have to just say, okay, I'm going to jump in the deep end? So many people have to walk in up to their ankles, think, well, I don't know if I really want to learn how to swim. I'm still in the water. So what do you think from a game-changing standpoint or a change maker standpoint, what kind of mindset do you think you have to say, okay, I'm going to dive in? And when you do dive in, how important is preparation?
It's interesting that you should ask that question. I didn't really know what I was getting into when I ran for mayor. I didn't realize that I'm totally giving up my privacy. And had I known that, I might not have done it. So preparation is good, but I learned about a month ago that, do you know how many books are published? You probably do, every day?
No.
8,000 books every day. And so when I was speaking at University of Texas, El Paso, their student engagement and leadership center found the book organically and worked it into a Powerful Pages program last semester. So I'm speaking to the students out there. I said, look, the likelihood of you guys finding the book and integrating it into a curriculum, that's a 1 in a million chance. And if I'd have known, going in, authoring this book, that the chances of it being successful, which fortunately it has been, are infinitesimal. So you do have to have some knowledge ahead of time, but you just have to be willing to take that leap of faith. And once you do it one time, it gets easier.
True. It's the first time. It's the first step. We talked off air, so you can give up as much of this as you'd like. But you would probably be one of the last people, you talk about infinitesimal, you'd probably be one of the last people that anyone who knew you would think this guy is going to be mayor of Augusta and he's going to write a book that's going to impact a lot of lives, because your college start and stop wasn't exactly smooth, was it?
No, no. And I tell you, I would tell people when I was in office, I'm like, everybody that went to school with me in high school and college and even after college, I get it. Nobody saw this coming. But I think, and I've mentioned to you, I failed out of the University of Georgia 3 times. And that's nothing to your younger listeners. That's nothing that I would recommend. But you just have to keep trying. And I think it's that, sort of rebelliousness or being willing to go against the grain that led me to run for mayor, that led me to do a radio show for a year, that led me into writing this book. And it's, at the age of 52, to be out there and putting all your money on the book and making a living out of it. It was a little scary prior to this happening, but one thing I will say, we will make it through this. I know we will. And I think it hasn't stopped me from continuing to promote the book, from continuing to do stuff online. I'm not going to let this situation, it's scary. I don't even look at my brokerage account because I think that's just right now, I can't do anything about that. So we'll all make it through, but we'll all make it through together.
Yeah, I looked at mine yesterday. I'm doing the same thing. I'm focusing on what I can influence, and I'm containing what it is that I can't. And I think that's the way you move forward through life. I'm a big always forward believer. One step at a time, keep moving.
I couldn't agree more. You're going to get knocked down, but you just got to keep moving. And that's we go back to survival instinct. That's what everybody needs to focus on doing right now. You'll get a kick out of this. So I've started doing an Instagram post every day, going to check the mail with a cocktail. So I walk down the and give commentary. Now I've put all this pressure on myself because people are loving it. And they're like, well, what are you going to do tomorrow? But I think that's one thing that I know that I can do in this situation. If I know that I'm putting a smile on people's faces, I'm not making light of the situation, but it's making people laugh. And that's a good thing that we can all do for each other now.
And I've been in certain pockets, I've been castigated for this, but I'm living my life. Now, I'm not going out there recklessly exposing. I'm always thinking about this first. I always have. It's my mentality. It's the way I was raised. And I'm thinking about that, I'm being cautious, but I'm not going to sit and frown. I'm going to smile where I can, because the next moment is not promised. And I live my life that way as much as I can looking forward. I'm actually trying to be as relevant in the present as I possibly can. So I'm going to enjoy it. I'm not going to be, some people will make you feel as if you should be in this hunkered down, dour mood, sour with the rest of us and living in knee-shaking fear. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going out that way.
No, and I don't think, fear is a great enemy at this point in time. And I know that there's a lot of it out there. And, we're all vulnerable. I mean, we're all in this together. I'll give you a great example. We had a dear friend of ours whose father passed last week, and her mother's in her 80s. But we were talking to her on Saturday night, and she was just bawling, crying. She said, my mom is in her 80s. Her friends can't come to see her. We have to have just a graveside service for the family. And how difficult going through, a family member passing in this situation. But I told my wife, I said, you know what? That's happening all over the world right now. And so I think really what binds us together is our humanity. But it is okay to laugh these times. I mean, Lord knows we need it now more than ever, but still to remain positive. And here again, we'll come through this. I guarantee you that.
Effective leadership. How do you measure your leadership in terms of its effect?
I will tell you that's a great question. And to me, I talk about it in the book. The only power that true leaders should concern themselves with is the power to inspire. So no one individual can do anything alone, but if you can inspire people to work with you, there's nothing you can't do. So seeing, during my time in office, I focused on three things mainly: economic development and job creation, healing the racial divide, and running more efficient and effective government. So when I would have people come up to me and say, but I stayed on point and stayed on message. But when people could see tangible results in those three areas, that gives them, and I agree with you. I believe in under promising and over performing, and so I never made promises that I couldn't keep. But here again, if you can inspire people, and people would say to me, well, you've got a thankless job. Well, I never, sequestered myself. I was always out around with the people I served. I'd go to the Y every morning. I'm like sitting in the steam room at the Y with a bunch of sweaty dudes, and politics was always, you know where you stand, and nobody's above anybody else.
Right.
But I said it wasn't a thankless job. To this day, 5 years out, there's not a week that goes by that people don't thank me for what I did. So, and they thank me on a daily basis for 9 years in office. So if you get that kind of feedback, you know that you're leading effectively.
We were talking about jumping off the deep end, getting involved and learning on the fly. There's no wrong answer. There's just a point observation. It becomes very personal. What do you think is paramount to begin to start day one? Confidence or competence?
I think it's a combination of both. You do need to be competent. It's when I ran for mayor, I was actually taken in a back room by a bunch of business leaders who I know and respect, and told not to run, that I would be the best candidate, but that I hadn't paid my dues. And I'm competitive as anything. And I was like, look, I'm going to run and I'm going to win whether you guys are in the race or not. But I told them on that day, it was not a smoky back room, but I said, look, I've run a small business. I've run a nonprofit. I've chaired boards of directors. What is the difference? I've had all the leadership experience that I need. What is the difference between that and being mayor? So it was a combination of competence, but also confidence. But I basically said, look, if you were going to hire a mayor, who would you hire out of the field of candidates? And that, to me, I took the politics out of it, but it's definitely a combination of both. But I'll tell you what else is key is to resist the temptation to give in to the vocal minority. And I'll give you an example. So I would have my coworkers that were elected officials tell me, well, golly, my phone's lighting up on this issue. And so they thought I'm like, well, how many calls do you get? 10. And I'm like, well, we're a city of 200,000 people, but in elected positions, and I know in corporate positions as well, sometimes if you think that the vocal minority is prevailing public opinion, it's not. So you need to, as you take that leap of faith, realize that you're going to have critics and cynics. You're going to have a vocal minority if you're trying to make change that's not going to like it, and they're not going to like you because they like the status quo. And there are a lot of people that profit greatly off the status quo remaining in place.
The status quo is the antithesis of what we espouse, and that is change to become better, change for the betterment of people, creating that environment, enabling people then to prove themselves in that environment, the fertile environment that's free from fear. You're sparking my curiosity on this, and you're also bringing me to a point of pain. And I think for the listener, if you've ever sat through a meeting where the vocal minority takes over, you know what Deke's talking about, because you were at a macro level talking about with a city of 200,000. At the micro level, in most meetings, it's the vocal minority that win the day, and some of the great thoughts are locked away because they're in fear, or they don't want to be ostracized when they speak out. So you're left with a consensus for whatever reason, for popularity, for whatever reason there is to kiss up to the leader. You generally have that in most meetings. That's what I found.
Well, and to me, courage is to be able to resist the vocal minority. And I will tell you, I had an experience when I was in office after the financial meltdown, as we went into the recession. And this is applicable. We've just passed the stimulus package, but I would share with people that at that point in time, that was the largest spending bill the federal government had ever passed. And so to make all the rules and regs having to do with it, they have to do it on the fly. I experienced that. So we were eligible for some stimulus funds to help depressed area next to an established neighborhood. So usually the commission, which is the governing body here, would have to sign off before applying for the grant funds. But there was no time to go through the regular process, so I signed off on it. And it ended up, people said I'd broken the law, I'd broken rules. I'm like, look, this is, I'm not going to put millions of dollars at risk. But then the neighborhood thought that it was going to be low income housing. They got extremely upset while I was trying to explain the reality of the situation to them. And it was a scary time then too. But in a public meeting, I said at the clubhouse at this neighborhood, I said, I feel like I'm in some of the healthcare debates. And everybody kind of oohed. And I said, or on the Jerry Springer show. And naturally, that did not go over well. And it was on the 11 o'clock news. Naturally, that was the quote that I ran. But I'm like, I am going to call it like I see it. And I would tell people that would be very angry calling in, I'm like, look, I'm going to treat you with dignity and respect, but I expect you to do the same thing too. And if not, this call is over. But I think that's how you've got to lead in those situations, because basically giving into the vocal minority in every situation, I compare it to if you gave into your child every time they threw a tantrum, what kind of child would you raise? And same thing in a business, if you give in the vocal minority every time, you're not going to progress.
You would have a child that was feral, and you'd have a company full of people that were infighting the same thing as feral. So now I'm a company who believes that we believe this as a company, that the status quo is our death knell, that we'll atrophy if we don't continue to move forward. In your book, you're highlighting 7 attributes of change makers. What are those attributes of a change maker?
Creativity, courage, connecting, listening, transparency, composure, and character.
You're going to circle one. Which would it be?
Character.
There you go.
I think the others flow from character. I mean, if you're a person of good integrity and good character, you're usually a good listener as well. You're usually very transparent as well. But it's, in order to be a leader, and I tell people this, being elected to any office or any title does not make you a leader. In order for you to be a leader, the people you serve, whether it's your employees, whether it's the constituents in your community, have to be willing to follow your lead. So I think character is at the top of that list, even though it's on the bottom of the list as stated in the book.
Writing for some is a vocation. Writing for some comes from, I think, a source of undeniable inspiration. And I think you would fall into the latter category of undeniable inspiration to write the book. So what was your form of inspiration when you started putting this together?
It really, I want people to use it as a blueprint in their businesses, but at the local level in politics too, that there is a different way that we can do things, that you can lead in a statesman-like fashion still. And growing up, there were statesmen on both sides of the aisle politically that I admired and whose behavior I emulated during my time in office. But now, there aren't a lot of those statesman-like leaders out there. But and leadership, you can see it within the organization. I use Chick-fil-A as an example. Truett Cathy has done, you can tell that the service is different at a Chick-fil-A. So the way that Truett Cathy built that organization, and that's what I tried to do with local government, is to really change the culture to where I had to know, and I thanked our employees all the time because they're out there on the front lines doing the job.
I'm writing notes. I've got copious notes, and I'm going to buy your book. I'm writing dignity, respect, character, and I've circled one part that I think is very important to really dive into, and that's mentors. You were fortunate, not all of us are, but you were fortunate to have mentors who were in the great, you know, that the World War II era, that actually fought with that metal, that had that certain character, you know, that group. Tell me how important that was in your formation, and tell me where we can find mentorship today that is similar to that type of.
That is, I'm so glad you asked that question. My father was my true north. And as I mentioned, I think before we came on air, he flew B-17 bombers in World War II, when the survival rate at one point was like, or the mortality rate was 89%, you know, for teenagers. But he was raised, his father died when he was 12. He was raised by a single mother who was a school teacher during, you know, the Great Depression, one of 5 children, but went on to Virginia Tech and, you know, climbed the corporate ladder, became a CEO. So he was a great mentor of mine, but I've had a lot of others. But that's key, and they're out there. And, you know, anybody listening to this, you need to seek them, because it's a good mentor is worth their weight in gold. But that's a huge goal of mine, is outreach to the next generation of leaders and helping to mentor them. And as I mentioned, you know, it's so shortly after the book came out, I was doing an interview with a young lady who was 20 something years old. And she said, well, don't you think, you know, leading to the middle is kind of lukewarm? And I said, I think that bringing people together around a common cause and a common goal is extremely cool. But then I thought, you know, if you're under the age of 30 politically, this is all they've ever known, this hyper partisanship. So I'm hopefully can help mentor that next generation of leaders, because they're out there, you know, and we just got to go find them, or they need to find us too.
It's an extension of the great generation, and that's the legacy that you're still to this day providing and extrapolating. And I think that's critical when you said they'll find you. I think that the worthy mentor attracts the worthy mentee. You know, and I really do believe that. I believe the people that want to find the easy way, the elixir, the magic pill, the 4-hour body, the 4-hour work week, and they don't want to put in the work it takes to get to that certain point, to really make the sacrifices inherent in reaching the goal or the reward. Those are the people that will take any kind of advice, and they're knocking door to door looking for the way. I want those people who are prepared to do the work, roll up their sleeves, understands if it's to be, it's up to them, take personal responsibility for their product every day. Those are the people that seek me out, that are worthy of my time. And that's what I draw as my gauntlet. That's my deadline right there.
Well, you just touched on something, and that's part of leadership, is don't ask your people to do anything you're not willing to do yourself. And it's about rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty. But I'll tell you an interesting experience I had. So I spoke at University of Texas, El Paso 2 weeks ago. But when I found out, I didn't know that they had found my book. And so last fall, all of a sudden I see all these students throwing up pictures on Instagram of them reading my book. So I reached out to them, and I did a video call with them for the last day of their meetings around the book, which happened to be my birthday, November 20th. But I had a young lady from Vietnam who told me, I've got tears in my eyes. You've given me hope in government again. So I was able to meet her when I went to El Paso. But it's, you know, the timing on that, I think it's a jumping off point for a career. But that connection with that university, which is something that I will always treasure. And I told the students there, I'm like, look, and you know, they have reached out to me a lot since things have gone sideways. But I told them, I'm like, if you ever need to talk about something, you know, here's my cell phone number. I'd be happy to. So I think it was really, the timing on that couldn't have been better.
Where do we find you? Now we have an audience that wants to read your book. Where can they find you?
Deke-Copenhaver.com.
You want to spell the last name for us?
Copenhaver. HAV is in Victor ER.
And you contribute to Forbes as well, correct?
I do.
There's a recent article on, you want to check Deke out, but there's a recent article in Forbes, which is really salient to the times. So I think, and that was extremely well received and extremely well done. So
Well, I appreciate it. It's leading in times of crisis, being the calm at the center of the storm. And we need calming leaders now more so than ever. But one of the things that I talk about in that blog is that you need to focus in leadership positions on never violating the public trust or the trust of the people you serve, your employees, to begin with. Because if your leadership is not perceived to be trustworthy during calm times or prosperous times, then when a crisis hits, you've effectively undermined your ability to lead during a crisis. If people don't trust you, when you're making a big profit, then when things start to go through the floor, they're definitely not going to trust your leadership.
To me, you're a twin beacon of hope and inspiration cutting through this fog of uncertainty. I could see why people would reach out to you. I could see why your book has done so well. And one of the things we talked about off air, a little bit about the great generation, but there are people in the past history that were change makers. Tell me some of the most important change makers in history for you.
I'll tell you, Martin Luther King Jr. has been a hero of mine for, just the fact that his peaceful resistance. I mean, that's amazing to me. But I tell people he didn't, he was not an elected official. He wasn't president or anything. And people when you look at the Million Man March, I think there's a perception out there that the civil rights movement was all, successful due to African Americans. He was able to inspire people from all walks of life. And I was watching a documentary on him, and I looked at the Million Man March, and it was not just African American people in the crowd there, but he's a guy who had the power to inspire. I mean, his speeches and his oratory, and that's what a lot of people don't know. And it goes back to what we've discussed, that most people probably don't realize that his "I Have a Dream" speech was 99% ad-libbed. So, and he threw out, the script on that one and just spoke from his heart. And boy, talk about a change maker. That's pretty powerful.
Extremely powerful. Who else? We talked a little bit about Churchill. What do you think the significance of Churchill was in Western civilization? There's two camps that are split when you travel over to England in terms of Churchill, where I consider him, frankly, one of the saviors of Western civilization. And some other people would say different, but how do you view Churchill? Personal curiosity.
I agree completely with you that he was one of the saviors of Western civilization, but we go back to calm, composed leadership. I mean, people look to him, and I'm sure, and not everybody knows that he suffered with depression. I mean,
yeah. Black Dog, he called it.
Yeah, Black Dog Depression. Good song by Led Zeppelin too. But but change-making leaders are not perfect by any means, and he was not perfect, but just that composure. I mean, I think about Charles de Gaulle and General de Gaulle during World War II, and my mom thought he was like the sexiest guy alive. But I remember old footage of, there are bullets hitting all around him, and he's sitting there calmly smoking a cigarette. Not that I would recommend smoking to anybody, but I'm like, that's the type of leader that, I want to be, is measuring yourself against the great ones. And I sought out mentors when I was in office. Joe Riley, who was mayor of Charleston, South Carolina for 30 years or so. He was called America's mayor. But he was a mentor of mine, and leading through hurricanes and everything. What he did in the church shootings in Charleston, how he was able to lead that city through, is amazing. So these change-making leaders are still out there, but what I'm trying to do is really mentor that next generation of change makers. But we have examples throughout history, whether it's Churchill or De Gaulle or, Martin Luther King, or there are case studies out there that people can still look to.
And it's a great point. There's so much we can pull from those pages, from those people. We may not be able to actively converse with them, but we can read their thoughts. We can get into the action, the orientation, the character, the style, the way, and then we can make it and form our own from there. I think it's very important that we form our own based on what we find to be of value. And a value, the final arbiter of value for me are the people that I attempt to impact, not what I intend.
Yeah, and absolutely. But you and I discussed this before we're going on air. I do everything, every speech extemporaneously. And there's got to be an authenticity to what you're doing in leadership positions. And we talked about it. It drives me crazy to see politicians read off of teleprompters. I'm like, That does not connect with me in any way, shape, or form. But I think that's the issue that the younger generation, millennials, and the generation beneath them have with, they're not responding to politics because there's no authenticity there. So to be a change-making leader, there's got to be authenticity. And bringing up Churchill again, I mean, those speeches, or Martin Luther King, they send chills down my spine to listen to them today because they are authentic.
Deke, I'm curious to learn how you define success in your terms.
That's a very good question and an interesting question. So I've always tried to focus on mission over money, because I think if you focus on serving the mission first, the revenue increases and all will come from that. So right now, I would define success with regards to the book as it touching the most lives possible at a critical juncture in history. So last week, I dropped the price of the download on Amazon to 99 cents. And, you're an author. I'm like, at this point in time, some people are making money, who have arbitraged or in business, but most people aren't. And I thought, so that's the right thing for me to do now, is to drop it down to and it's still on Amazon at 99 cents per download. But I'm like, people need hope right now. And hopefully, and I tell people, it's not a self-help book. I'm still a work in progress. And I talk about difficult situations that I went through. My first wife committed suicide. I lost my mom to cancer a week after my 25th birthday. 8 days after I announced my run for mayor, we lost my mother-in-law. So you have these difficult times, but it hopefully will help inspire people at a time when they need it the most.
And I understand a lot of what the anvil of your character, how it was forged on what anvil, and a tremendous character. I'm not going to try to push out anything that was, it has to do with my books, but I gave all the proceeds, my proceeds, not the editors, from my first book to the Intrepid Fallen Heroes Fund. It made me feel good about doing something for a worthy cause. And I've probably given away more in the second book than I've sold. We sold a ton of it, but I love giving stuff away. If I can make a difference in someone's life because they read one line, one page that just, sparked that ember that was already in them, I feel like I won.
I agree too. And my wife, so I bet I'm the only Forbes book author whose wife carries around a book bag every place she goes. And, she was my best salesperson in this situation. Yeah. We gave a lot of them away, but it was interesting. And you talk about, so the first week my book came out, a gentleman on LinkedIn reached out to me. And he said, so it just became a thing that people are throwing up pictures in front of the Golden Gate Bridge and in front of the White House. So a guy reached out to me and said, look, I want you to know that your book hasn't just made it to the West Coast, it's made it to Africa.
That's awesome.
And so he's an economist in the Ivory Coast. And he said, the other night I had a sleepless night where I decided that the best term to describe me was Changemaker, but I wondered if there was anybody else out there who thought like me. So I Googled the term and came across your book. And so he shared with me what it had meant to him. And I actually just reached out to him the other day to make sure he's doing okay. But I'm like, in less than a week, that it could make a difference in somebody's life in Africa. How cool is that?
That
And
is, yeah,
that's
that's great.
better than any royalty check I'm ever going to cash.
You know what? That I'd frame that, put it somewhere. That's awesome. Without failure, there can be no success. I'm not one of these people who believe that you don't fail if you keep trying. I don't think that. So, what would you say? What would you share as your greatest failure, biggest failure, and then what did you learn from it?
Oh, golly, there have been so many. I gee, what would be my biggest failure? And I don't know that this would, so people, you learn from everything. So during my time in office, some people would say probably my biggest failure would be I was trying to get a riverfront baseball stadium in downtown Augusta. And it just, I could not get the governing body to work with me. They wouldn't even approve building financing package. It was for a piece of state-owned property that had sat vacant for years that nobody had come up with any kind of a plan for. So ultimately, we're on the border with South Carolina. So across the Savannah River is North Augusta. Well, North Augusta ultimately built the stadium. So, and the people that were against it, the vocal minority on this side, basically said, well, how did we lose it to? But I said, if, you know, call it a failure, but ultimately it's still right next to our downtown. And if we hadn't kept the team in the game, they'd have probably left the area entirely.
I'm going to place you now in the pantheon of the great ones that have been on the show. We've had a number of incredible guests. They have a tough time grappling with the word, not because they don't accept the word or the concept, but they think in terms of setbacks or something they learned from, but never really a final thought of failure. Not like the F's I used to get in math. They don't think of it like that, right? So
No,
they think it was just learning. It's just part of the learning curve.
it really is. It's just, and here again, as we've said, you've got to keep going, and nobody is going to bat 1,000. You know, there would be jobs lost here when businesses would close down. And I'm like, well, my response to that is not to lament that. We're going to do the best we can to help those workers find jobs. But I'm like, I'm going to go out there and continue to work in economic development and continue to recruit new businesses here, you know, so that people can go to work. So you can't stop. And I never really, I mean, I felt when businesses would close down, but there's nothing the government can do. And there were certain people that would try to pin it on the government. Well, it's the government's fault that we lost this business, but it's a business decision. And I looked at everything through a lens of a business, but so the baseball stadium issue had become an emotional issue where the critics and the cynics were driving the debate. But I told them the local baseball team, they can't expand at their current location. And if you can't grow your business at a current location, you need to find another location. So it was a pretty simple business decision.
I have ended every show with one question, but you've earned the bonus round. So I'm going to go 1 and 1A. Okay.
Cool.
The final question is this, that if you were going to write a paragraph, that you've obviously written a book, but if you were going to write a paragraph that would offer people some insight to live in a better life. So you're at the end of days now, you lived a tremendous life. And then at the end, you want to write that one paragraph so other people can learn from it, grow from it, and be better for it. What would that paragraph look like?
There's so much you can't control, but one thing you can control is your attitude. You know, and that your attitude doesn't just impact you, it impacts everybody around you. So focus on having that good attitude. You know, that goes a long, long way.
I called you the beacon for hope and inspiration. So I'm going to wrap around the first part of our conversation on the crisis going on today with COVID-19. Give us some hope and inspiration. Give us a way through this tunnel. Give me your words to close it out.
I'm I'm not an epidemiologist, obviously, but we will get through this. I think we'll get through this faster than we think. I think it'll be several months. I think the biggest concern that I have is the fear. So we don't have a food shortage, and if people would not go to the grocery store and hoard, our food industry can continue to stock the shelves. We're not going to run out of toilet paper. We will be good, but it's going to hurt in the short term. But that's the thing that I would remind people is that we're all in it together. There is nobody that's not being impacted by this. I mean, people are impacted in different ways, but focus on that humanity and focus on check if there's somebody that lives alone, check on. There's so much that we can do that is within our control. And I do believe that the communities that pull together are really going to be the ones that come out of this faster than anybody else.
Deke, great point for those people who feel isolated. Call them, stay within 10, 11, 12 feet, but at least try to make that so they don't feel like they are all alone, because we're every one of us, we're in this together as a collective. This is not an individual proposition to fight our way through. We are in this together. We'll make it through together as one. You did a great job of summarizing that. You've been a tremendous, tremendous guest on the show. We need to have another one just on authenticity. Thank you very much, sir.
Man, it's been a pleasure, and I'd love to come back whenever you'd have me.